Hello everybody, this is Snail at Snail Werx, and if you found this video, you're in the right place if you're wanting to find out which turbine wheel and compressor wheel is right for your build. Now, if you are one of our customers, whether it be a Porsche, Audi, or Saab customer, you're in the right place. Now, if you're looking at building out your K24, K26, or looking at building out your Mitsubishi TD04, all these options are gonna be about the same. Now, if you're as large as a GTX 30, it doesn't really make a difference at the end of the day because all turbine wheels and or compressor wheels are very relevant within the market. So we're going to go over the turbine wheels and the exhaust housings briefly. We're going to be going over the compressor wheels and the compressor housings briefly and kind of go in depth about what makes sense for your driving habits, the way that you want your turbo to spool and the way you want your turbo to make power. Okay, so we're gonna jump straight into this. I have the K24, K26, and the Mitsubishi TD04 19T here. Now, whether this be a TD04, TD05, TD06, or the K24, K26 turbo options, it's all gonna be relevant. So now, what I will tell you is, it's really important to make sure that you set up your CHRAs correctly. Now, a lot of people, you can go online, find different turbo setups that are usually unbalanced or not properly balanced, or the wrong wheel on the wrong turbine. Now, what I will tell you is I've got a 6x6 here and a standard 12 blade. This is going out to a customer here relatively soon. And this is a pretty common setup. Now, mind you, most of the Mitsubishi TD04s that get shipped out of here are usually 19Ts. We do have occasional 20 or 22T, and once in a blue moon, maybe a 20G. Now, we are going to start with the exhaust side. Now, mind you, on the CHRA, this is also known as the turbine wheel, and some people just call it an exhaust wheel. So getting into that, I'm going to bring you down here. I'm going to show you some of the different options. I've got the 12, 11, 9, and 5x5. Now, being that the 12 here on my right, your guys' left, that is going to be the quickest spooling. It's going to have a power band that is sooner in the RPM range. It is also going to have the highest EGTs if not properly tuned. And all the way here on my left, your guys' right, that's the 5x5. The 5x5 is going to essentially have the power band be towards the end of your rev range and is going to have the lower EGTs depending on if tuned properly. Now, typically, I tell people that are going for the most power possible, you're gonna go with a 5x5. People that want the most in-city driving, the most torque, typically at 11 or 12. And if you're wanting something in between that's going to essentially make good power, have overall good range in every aspect, a 9 blade is typically the one to go with. So most of my customers land on a 9 or a 11. Now, once again, when we sell a turbo to somebody, it's up to them, and we are going to help direct you based off of your driving habits. Okay, so we have a standard exhaust housing here from a Saab B207, which is the 93SS in the Saab world. Now, this is a standard Mitsubishi TD04 L, which is a slightly smaller. Now, depending on which market and which year 9.3 you have, you're gonna most likely have a 6cm housing. Some do have a 5cm housing, however. Now, the 6cm housing, as you see here, is unmilled. We haven't done anything to it yet. It's just standard stock straight from Mitsubishi. Is gonna utilize that smaller L blade. So as you can see, it goes in there nice and easy, no issue, perfectly machined for that. Now, what I will tell you is, when you have exhaust housings, most of them can be modified or changed. So the thing that's really important is converting this, particularly to this car, to a larger HL style wheel. Now I have an HL here. This is the 5x5 from the shot earlier. That essentially goes in here now. Now, obviously, if you take this out and put the HL blade on the table here and put the L in, it's gonna have a lot of movement. So we're increasing substantial amount of size. Now, why I'm showing you this isn't necessarily particular to Saabs, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video. What this is showing you is that most turbos, not all, most exhaust housings can be milled out to usually go to an HL. So if you're another particular car brand that is running an L versus an HL, definitely look into doing this. Now, going to other Saab housings that we also do heavily in-house is, this is a 7/8cm housing for a Saab 9.5. Now, as you can see, you have a much larger hole there. What does that typically mean? Well, anytime we start modifying the exhaust housing, the main reason we're doing that is A, for better flow. which in turn usually means you are moving your power band up. So if I took the standard 5 centimeter housing and then I went to a 7, I am going to see a substantial difference in my power band. My power band is going to be later. So some customers will actually do a 6 centimeter housing because they still want that spool. However, I usually try to convince everyone to go to a 7 or an 8 centimeter housing on their 9.5s or other equivalent cars, solely for the fact that it does lower your EGTs. The lower your EGTs means the more air you're effectively pumping, that's going to be a little cooler, which at the end of the day means more boost. So lower EGTs means more power. Now, on this particular housing being a 7 centimeter, the thing that's really important to understand is you are manipulating that power band. So if you have a wheel, a turbine wheel, such as, let's say, a 5x5 with that larger 7 centimeter, you will notice a difference in your power band coming in much later. Now, mind you, typically at the end of the day, we're talking 500, 600 RPM, in some cases at most 800 RPM. It's not really so much the exhaust housing that's going to be affecting as much as the tune. So what I will tell you is though, at the end of the day, if you go to a larger housing, it is going to greatly benefit the car because you are going to be lowering those EGT temps. Now, mind you, a lot of it is tune based, so don't sit there and say, hey, just because you have the largest wheel and the largest housing that your EGT temps are going to be non-existent, they'll still very likely be anywhere between 950 Celsius to 1,000 if not tuned properly. So take that into consideration. So moving over to the next set of options are going to be the compressor housing. Okay, now moving on to the compressor side of the turbo, we're going to talk about the compressor wheels. Now, traditionally there are 3 options. There is like a 1/3.5 option, which we are briefly going to talk about. But starting out, we're going to start with what is essentially called a cast wheel. Now, a cast wheel traditionally starts out as a liquid metal, poured into a mold, and you end up with the said mold desired shape, which is this particular wheel. Now, the wheel as a whole is going to be more prone to imperfections such as air bubbles that are in these blades or within the actual wheel itself. Now, traditionally, you will find these usually on an OEM application or maybe even on like a cheaper off-brand turbo that you may find online. So this is typically your starting point when you're talking about a turbo. They're usually essentially going to be a mold-based wheel. Now, moving from the cast to what we call flank billet wheel, or what some people call a CNC billet wheel, we are going to briefly see a better throttle response, anywhere between 4 to 7%. Typically 4 to 7% throttle response is going to be something you're going to be able to notice. So just going from a 6x6 here to another 6x6, you will see significantly feel it in your pedal field when you are effectively driving the car. Now, moving forward, if you were to essentially take this wheel and compare it from the strength aspect, you're going to see substantially more strength in this wheel. Now, mind you, the flank and or cast wheels as a whole may look the same and may actively act the same. However, the strength, which you can't really see that necessarily up close, is there. Now, we have actually seen the cast wheels come apart around 24, 25 PSI, this particular setup as we're touching here. And these on average, you're going to see anywhere between 24 to 30 PSI without any issues, and way past that. But typically you are going to start to see failure sooner with your cast versus your flank. Now, if you are going for a higher boost application, a cast wheel would not make sense for you. Now, when people mail in their OEM turbos, we do see these cast wheels all chewed up really bad. And we have some customers that, essentially they come in with a core and they'll just be wheel. I mean, we're talking the whole corners of them completely gone. I mean, absolutely destroyed. And we actually had a customer who bought an off-brand turbo, as we'll say, who actually had one of these 19T wheels in their turbo with less than 500 miles, and it had already eaten the side of the housing because it was so unbalanced. But also those weak imperfections in that blade took that blade out. Now, moving from the flank milled, which is essentially, like I said, a CNC'd solid piece of aluminum, we're going to talk about one step further, which is a point milled. Now, mind you, this is a CNC'd wheel just the same as a flank milled. However, this is on another CNC machine with an additional axis. That means that you're able to get in there and get more in depth. Now between these two compared to the cast, you're able to get a more aggressive curve on the actual blades themselves. You're able to actually get a better design for airflow solely for the fact that you're going to effectively be able to do exactly what you want versus being forced to having a mold that you have to pull apart. So between these two, the biggest advantage of going from what you would say a traditional CNC flank mill to a point milled is you're going to see anywhere between 15 to 20% more power just between these two. So if we've actually had a traditional 9-blade, which we do offer for sale, versus the point milled, we actually saw 18.5% more power on the point milled versus the regular flank milled. Now that last and final category, I'm going to go ahead and set these aside, and I'm going to bring in this guy, which is actually for one of our customers. We had him earlier, is a snake milled. Okay, so this is a 22T for a 2.8T Saab 9.3 Aero. And this is essentially that other option that is essentially going to allow for additional 4 to 6%. Now, mind you, at the end of the day, it is going to be somewhat noticeable on a dyno, but from a driving experience, you're really not going to notice a difference. Now, one thing I will say is the 22T snake milled, equivalent to 20G, is going to almost spool and make the same characteristics of a 20G, but stay more balanced. The 20Gs tend to become more unbalanced because the wheel size is so large. So typically when we are talking about this particular turbo, we typically don't like to go past the 22T. Now we're gonna talk more in depth about the different styles of turbo sizes, all the way from a 11T all the way up to a 22T and 20G, and kind of go over what option makes the most sense for you and your build. I am going to briefly bring up something else that may be relevant to somebody else watching this, not so much our customers, but someone else that may just be wanting to be more informed. Typically on a turbo wheel, you have what's called a flat back or a super back or a deep super back, and that's solely based off of this slight curvature on the back of this turbine. So as you can see, it's not perfectly flat. You have a little bit of a lift, almost like a little hill, a little mound. That effectively is going to affect the velocity speed of that actual wheel. So flat back is typically an older style wheel. They're really not traditionally used anymore. It is still occasionally pops up on the market on some of the cheaper option turbos. Okay, now we're gonna talk about wheel options size. We're not gonna talk about the blade count or any of that yet. We're gonna talk about the size and more or less what that's going to look like and how it's going to affect your build. Now, what I will tell you is most of the cars in the world that were essentially Mitsubishi TD04 came in the variants of an 11, a 14, a 15, a 19. Those are typically what you see. Now, in the Saab world of things, a lot of our Saab customers have what is essentially a 14 wheel here. Or 15 wheel, which is found in the 9.5s and the 2.8 9.3 SS, but this is actually from a 2005 Aero. And now some people will have something slightly smaller, which is an 11T in European and other markets, where in the United States, the smallest we got on the Mitsubishi side was the 14T. So as you can see, we have a 14T. Now this is a cast wheel. We have what is called a 16T. Now the 16T obviously is a step up, and we have a 19T here as well. And then we have the largest wheel option we offer for sale, which is essentially called a 20G. Now we do have some other options in between there. We have essentially a 22T, 21, 22, 20T, 18T. We typically stick to primarily 19Ts and or how should I say 22Ts. Those are typically where most people fall, but we do offer multiple wheel options. Now, what I will say is the really only reason someone would want to go with a 16T wheel in comparison to like a 14T is if they didn't want to upgrade to an HL. So if you're not planning on updating your exhaust side of the turbine or the exhaust housing, this would be the largest wheel I would recommend going to. Now, mind you, if you go past a 16T, you're kind of gambling. Now, a lot of our 2.0 customers and the 9.3 world, the Saab 9.3 world that is, they actually will buy essentially what you would call a SAT attempt balanced 19T from online that is essentially a 19T wheel on the stock 11. Now, the problem with that, when you have that little tiny 11 housing still in place, and you have this wheel like so, it becomes very unbalanced. So it's very bottom heavy. So it's to the point where it doesn't want to balance at all. This becomes very unbalanced and very heavy very quickly. So we typically do not tell our customers to go past the 16T. So if you effectively were to put the 16T wheel on there, more or less about the same. Now, mind you, this is a very crude explanation here, but it does become a little bit more balanced. So instead of falling one direction, it kind of stays balanced. So it really kind of shows you how unbalanced this setup actually is. Going back to the 19T here, it's very heavy. I mean, it does not want to balance at all. So it kind of tells you that that's a no-go. Now, obviously from the factory, it comes with this 14T here, which once again is not a big deal. It's pretty well balanced, not a big deal. But you got to remember, this weighs a whole ounce less than the upgraded versions. So that's kind of a note I wanted to kind of bring up, just because we do get asked that all the time. If someone can make a 19T with the stock exhaust side, you can, but we won't warranty it and we don't sell them. So you can go online, find a bunch of off-brand turbos that'll do that, but we've had customers that have done that, and the turbos have lasted anywhere between 500 to 1,000 miles. So highly recommend you don't go that route. If you do, make sure you have a warranty with it so you can replace it every year, because that's probably the rate you'll be replacing them. Next, moving forward, so if you get rid of the 14T wheel here, and we're just solely talking about the 19, we're gonna get rid of the 16 wheel as well, the 19 versus the 20G wheel. Now, between the 19 to the 20G wheel, these are going to range anywhere between making 360 horsepower all the way to 450. Now, a lot of people are going to scoff, make comments, there's no way you're making 450 on a TD04 HL. Well, that's not true. Depending on the displacement of the motor, there are other applications out there, maybe not so much in the Saab world. Now, we have personally seen, there is a guy who actually, a Volvo customer who actually is making 480 brake horsepower on a 20G turbo setup, which is just unheard of. E85, fully built car. Now, mind you, in the Saab world of things, the most we've ever seen on a 20G slash 22T, if you kind of go up there on a snake milled, is you're getting closer to that 425 to 450 horsepower. Realistically though, a 19T to 22T, being realistic, depending on your fuel, if you're running a 91 versus 93 octane, which is 98 in the rest of the world, but if you're running, let's say, half E85, half 91 to get you to 96 octane, which we have some customers that go that route, you'll definitely be around the 400 horsepower range without any issues between the 19 to the 22 range. Okay, so just to recap real quick on the size of the compressor wheels. Like I said, 14T that we started out with all the way to the 20G. Really, you can take into consideration that the size of the wheel obviously is going to correspond with more power. However, the bigger the wheel, that means you're gonna have more lag. So there is kind of a nice in between. That's typically why most of our customers fall on a 19T, because they still wanna have that quick response from their Mitsubishi TD04. However, there are some people that are wanting power over spool time, especially if you're doing highway pulls, things like that. That is going to be more prone to be more looking at the power aspect of things and less spool time. So a 22T or 20G may make sense if you're solely on the highway trying to make as much power as possible. For overall drivability and realistic good power, lower EGTs, a 19T is kind of the sweet spot. We do have some people occasionally on a 20 or a 21T. At that point, I just usually tell people go to a 22T. Now, as we had our one customer here earlier with that snake mill 22T, I typically try to push people towards this. It is a more expensive wheel compared to the 20G, but it is significantly better wheel. Quicker spool time, better throttle response. Overall, it is the better of the two options. Yes, this one will make more power. This is the way to go though. Now looking at the different blade setups we have here. We have 6 here in front of us, which are pretty close to everything we sell. Now, the only one that we really don't have on here that we do sell a little more frequent than not is we do have a 9-blade non-point milled. So that one is not currently here. Now, if you're looking and if I ask someone, what could you tell me is the one that sticks out, that looks different from all the rest? And this is typically the wheel you're gonna find on the market. You're gonna find on your cheaper turbos on eBay. You're gonna find on your budget builds, and it's gonna be this guy right here. So this is a standard 6x6 wheel. As you can see, it does not have extended wheel here. Now, mind you, that not having that extended wheel option is going to see a decrease by about 6% in throttle response and or spool time. So that's actually pretty substantial. So I don't even really typically even offer this style of blade. It's honestly, it's inferior to any other blade without, now mind you, the machining is a little bit more tedious when you do have that extended lip there on that extended blade. This one not having that obviously is a cheaper wheel option. Now, what I will tell you is the thing that's the most important though is if you actually look at the center section here, you can notice that this is the largest surface area, which that also means that these blades are going to be the smallest. So yes, in theory, this one might be the heaviest, and it's the heaviest because it has the most amount of material. So that's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but typically you don't want a heavy wheel. Now, mind you, if we had a heavier turbine side and we needed a heavier wheel to offset that to get properly balanced, this might be a wheel that we would go with. Now, mind you, the thing that's crazy though to take into consideration is because we don't have that extended material out here, this almost weighs the same as this wheel. So you're almost getting the same weight of wheel and effectively you have the same style blade. So these are both 6x6s. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna go over each of these individually to kind of give you the profile, the do's and don'ts, and kind of why you would pick one over the other. Now, each of these are gonna have a little bit different weights, so that's also gonna pair a little bit different with the turbine. So both of the 6x6s, the one in particular, this was the heaviest one over here for a multi-blade, or how should I say, for a 6x6. This one's gonna be our heaviest one here, right around 1.6 ounces compared to the one that's less, which is 1.5. So they're almost the same, but this one is slightly heavier. So I'm gonna go ahead and move this wheel out of here because this one is kind of irrelevant in the grand scheme of the wheels we sell. But just so if someone were online to see the difference, this is typically found on your cheaper Chinese turbos that typically are budget builds. Okay, now moving away from the 6x6 that doesn't have the extended blades, has a larger center section, that means those blades aren't as long, they have less area to gobble up the air, right? So we're gonna go ahead and get rid of that. That's something we typically, like I said, you find on a off-brand or a Chinese special that's maybe, you know, a little cheaper, which is okay if you're just trying to, you know, just throw a car together, but definitely not the best option. So moving forward to our other 5 blades that we have our 9-blade point milled, which we do also offer this in a standard non-point milled version. We have our 5x5. We have our 11-blade. We have our 6x6, and we have our 7x7. Now, realistically, 3 of these wheels are gonna perform similar, but they're not gonna necessarily have the same attributes. Now, what I will tell you is if you wanna make the most amount of torque, you wanna make the most amount of torque off the line, and you wanna have the quickest spool time, and when I say most amount of torque, I mean most amount of torque as soon as possible, not the most amount of torque overall. So the 11-blade is hands down going to be the best wheel for quick response. So if you're like, hey man, I just wanna have good, really aggressive in-city driving. We actually have a customer that's over in Delray Beach. He actually has 11-blade on 11-blade, absolutely loves it. And he's absolutely just murdering it through, you know, the busy streets of Southern Florida. So it makes sense if that's the style of driving you have or the lifestyle that you live. So that being said, it doesn't necessarily make sense for everybody. So I typically don't run 11 blades on my car. Allison typically doesn't run 11 blades on her car. So why would someone else run one of these? And I always say that the other aspect to think about this is if you are someone who is actively going to a aggressive track day that has a lot of turns or curves, that would also make sense. So don't think of it as just like, oh, hey, it's an 11 blade, I'm daily driving it. No, think of it as you want quick, fast response. You want acceleration. So This being said, our 11 blade comes in actually at 1.7 ounces. So this is the heaviest blade. Now, give or take a little bit of weight reduction there. Now this one has already been balanced. This one has been weighed at 1.7. So this has been properly balanced at 1.7 ounces. Now, that being said, this is also being paired to a turbine that is specifically for this setup. Now, what I would tell you is, moving away from the 11 blade, we're gonna actually go to the opposite end of the spectrum, and we're gonna go to what is the 5x5. Now, the 5x5 as a whole is probably what I would say the one that is going to make the most amount of power, will make the most amount of power if tuned properly. So the reason why the 5x5 is going to make the most amount of power is it has the least amount of material that is interfering with that air trying to cram into that compressor housing. Now, mind you, the 5x5 comes in at 1.3 ounces. And to put things in perspective of that, a 16T 6x6 comes in right at 1.2 ounces. So the 5x5 is actually substantially lighter than you would think. So this wheel paired with the right turbine is going to make the most amount of power and is going to most likely have probably the lowest EGT temps, solely because it's being paired with the appropriate turbine wheel. So if you're looking for solely the most amount of power as possible, you're not necessarily worried so much about spool time and or throttle response on the lower RPM side of things, paired correctly with the right turbine, this will make the most amount of power technically. Now, we don't sell these often because most people aren't, like I like to call dyno queen, someone that just wants to tune their car to make a number on the dyno. 9 times out of 10, a car that's solely designed that way is actually going to be slower because the torque curve is going to be all over the place or not as linear. So 5x5 is utilized to make the most amount of power, but doesn't necessarily mean it is right for your build. So that's going to take us down to the 6x6 and the 7x7. Now, mind you, all of the 7x7, 5x5, 6x6, they technically have double the amount of blades as, you know, more or less, or more as an 11 blade. 11 blade has 11 full, where 5x5 has 10. So technically this has less blades because it is only 5x5, which is 10 blades. Now, a 6x6 is going to have more than 11 blade because this puts us at 12, and a 7x7 puts us at 14. So why would someone go to a 6x6 or a 7x7? Well, at the end of the day, you are going to get better spool time. So a 6x6 is a traditional blade style setup because it's a good in-between. A 6x6 is technically going to make more power than essentially, we'll say a 7x7 because it's less material. However, it is going to have more lag. So what I tell people, a 7x7 is kind of a sweet spot. A 7x7 is going to have similar characteristics in spool time as an 11 blade, but it's not going to fall on its face as drastically. Okay, anybody that's looking for pretty much just acceleration and or maybe a little bit more mid-range, maybe not so much worried about the top end. Maybe you live in Ohio, you go to mid-Ohio often, or maybe you live in a really hilly area and you like to, you know, take turns a little bit more aggressively than someone that's really trying to get the best highway pulls. 11 by 11 actually works pretty well. So we have an 11 turbine and 11 on the cold side. Now this is going to give you slightly lower EGTs from that 12 blade. We don't like to typically see that 12 blade being used. Now, mind you, we do offer it because there are some people that are insistent on reusing some of their parts for rebuild, or some people that are just absolutely all about the acceleration. They don't care about making power at all. So this is kind of a good go-to for 11 by 11. Removing the 11 blade here, it's another option with the 11 blade, which is another really go-to good option. Ironically, is going to the 6x6. Now, the 6x6 being a little lighter, not much, this still bounces very well. Now what this is going to do is it's going to give you a similar to stock feel, but it is definitely going to not fall on its face as quickly. So this is going to give you close to a similar stock acceleration power band, but it's going to not fall off nearly as much. Now if you're either on a 9.5, a Vigan, a new gen 9.3 SS, this is kind of a pretty common wheel option. Now, typically we'll see this 11 and 9 blade be swapped out pretty frequently, but this is a pretty, what I would say, mainstream setup. Now, if you're looking for something that makes a little bit more sense and you're actually looking for more performance aspect, more power, the best acceleration and power you can go, I typically recommend actually what we have right here, which is our point milled. Now, mind you, this is a current customer. We're actually shipping this off to the UK. Now this guy, more or less, we've been working with him for a couple weeks now. It actually ships out tomorrow, and he actually opted for a 9-point milled blade. And then if you look on the hot side back here, we also have a 9 as well. Now, this is by far probably my favorite wheel option for a 19T. The reason I say that, primarily because you're gonna get the best of both worlds. You're gonna get lower EGTs. If you wanna make 400 horsepower, you can make 400 horsepower on this setup. Now, mind you, you're gonna obviously at that point want forged pistons, things like that. Now, we do have some customers on this exact setup making just right around 350 horsepower, 360-ish brake horsepower, that is, on stock internals. Now, the one customer has a custom tubular manifold, the other customer has a ported head. So there are some other modifications done to that motor to make that on that B207R. I would not recommend necessarily running 350 horsepower if you haven't addressed some of the other bolt-ons on the car. Now, that being said, this is still only 19T we're talking about. Now, moving forward to something like a 22T. Now, if we're gonna go as large as a 22T, as this customer did with the snake milled, I don't necessarily recommend a snake milled wheel because it is more expensive, but if you are specifically a 2.8 9.3 Aero customer, I highly recommend that you go to a snake milled setup, and I highly recommend that you go to a 5x5 exhaust wheel. Now, with this customer, we have a 9 blade, which is a good alternative as well. The 9 or the 5x5 are going to be the best two options, especially for our V6 customers. And some people ask, well, why would I want to go with the 5x5 or the 9, and particularly to the V6? Well, the V6, the exhaust housing itself, we don't actually modify that very often. And that is the choke point on the car. The manifolds themselves, they're actually not that bad. Now, mind you, they are one of the other choke points, but the turbo exhaust side is actually where the main choke point is. So what we can actually do is on the 5x5, we do just have the standard drop in, but we can actually mill that stock exhaust housing out 1 millimeter and go to a slightly larger. Now, I know you can't really tell here. Now, I mean, they're so close, but we have a slightly larger by 1 mil. The one is 1 mil larger, and that's something we can offer for our V6 customers. And there's additional fee because typically our V6 turbos we do not sell with the exhaust side. So if you do want to go full out, want to keep the stock turbo, you want to make 425, 450 horsepower, the snake milled is definitely the way to go. 5x5, and if you decide to go the 1 millimeter larger on the 5x5, it does make a difference on those EGTs, which is the main issue that the stock housings have. Okay, so those are some of the more commonly purchased wheel options. Now, what I will tell you is there really is no one size that fits all. Whether it be a 5x5 that you're trying to make the most amount of power, or it be an 11 blade you're trying to get the quickest spool time, there really is not necessarily one application that fits all. So we really wanted this video to help you make the best educational decision when purchasing your turbo. Now, there is so much more that goes into building a turbo, and what really sets us apart from our competitors being the upgraded thrust washers, the journal bearings, all that. We go through all of that. That's all upgraded. And I really want our information to be out there to help people, but we also are doing this for our customers. Now, if there is any other additional information, whether it be CFM charts or what kind of power goals you can actually expect to see, or really when you're going to see peak boost or peak spool, we have that information. So don't hesitate to email, shoot us a message, give us a call. We'll gladly go over that with you. Now, I really hope this video today is going to help you guide you down the path of purchasing a turbo through our website. If you end up purchasing elsewhere, we're really glad that we're just essentially making this information out there for the public to see so they can make better decisions. So as always, we're here to help, and thank you for watching.